Well, that's quite the act. I don't have the same history that Aubrey does with unions. I've been in our union for 18 months. What I do have is 20 years of working with oppressed groups. So when I took the job at CAS as a Black Education Awareness Coordinator, and when you say that at CAS, people go, whoa, can we just call you the BAC? And so people like calling me, I know, right? It sounded exactly what you thought it sounded like. And so I would come into this organization, and when I started there, they were all like, yeah, she's a good, respectable Black girl, right? Because I'm not those angry Black girls that they were afraid they might hire because, well, look at me, right? And so I had to address the fact that shadeism exists within. I have to identify the fact that as a light-skinned Black woman, there is a privilege that I walk with, that they're not as afraid of me at CAS. What they didn't know is that I'm probably more Black within than I am without. And so, as a sixth-generation Canadian Black person, I've never not known racism. My mother went to a segregated school. That was just life in Ontario for us. So coming into CAS, Aubrey refers to me as the sleeper because that's my job. I went into there specifically to blow that up. I know the 40-year history of an overrepresentation of Black kids in care. I've spent 20 years working with marginalized communities, single moms, victims of violence, to keep their children. Being Black is not a crisis. That is not a crisis that deserves to have your child apprehended, right? So we have to, right? And so part of it is, so they bring me in to do these educations to make people understand the history on racism and what it does. And I have this amazing presentation, and I'll send it to you. And really what it is explaining the fact that the impact of colonization is felt today. I'm almost 50 in a couple months now, and I'm not afraid to say that out loud. But when thank you, Oil of LA. Brother, inside voice. Right? So I remember going to school. And when my mom went to the school, she went through the door that said for coloreds. I went to the same school 25 years later. I walked through the door that said girls. My son went to that school. He walked through the door that didn't say anything. But they didn't talk about the history. They didn't talk about it. And they assumed that if we just paint over the signs that say colored, segregation, girls, that it'll just go away. We keep putting on more paint, make new, fresh policies. ARAO, we all have it. What does it mean? So one of the things that I do is talk about the history on anti-Black racism. Most of the kids that come into care are referred by the police and education, right? And these are the same systems that Brother just talked about. They're all contingent on each other. You would not have an education system that then could call into CAS and that we could then be the pipeline into the prison system. We are, marginalized bodies are what keeps non-for-profit alive. Let's call it what it is. The commercialization of discrimination makes money. $115 billion a year, to be exact. All right? So it's about looking at how systems become complicit because of money. And so one of those things is talking about the historical context. So if slavery ended in 1834 and segregation just ended in the 60s, have we actually pursued so much further? If 83% of our prison population are still incarcerated Black and red bodies, are we now in modern day slavery? Right? And so we have to have these real hard conversations. We have to ask how are we complicit, how are we benefited, and how are we challenging? And so needless to say, I'm not well liked at CAS some days. And I don't go by BIOC very often. And I do challenge people to say Black education, and we have to name it to change it. And that's something that we really say at CAS. So there's a reason I went into social work. It's not going to work. Okay, we still got it. So slavery ended in 1835. We moved into Jim Crow laws, the legalization of discrimination. We had sundown towns here in Ontario. And what that meant is when the sun went down, Black people needed to be out of town. And that still existed. When I lived in Prince George, British Columbia, there was a sign that said, if you're Indian, you must be out of town by 6 o'clock. Right? I just moved back here 10, 12 years ago. So this isn't that far off. And people go, wow, in Canada? Right? We don't know about it until it comes knocking on our door. Most people will say, I don't know about sexual violence until you experience it. And then, unfortunately, we all become painfully aware of these issues. Slavery is not unheard of here. We all have heard about Matthew DaCosta, the first young Black boy who was a translator. He actually spoke French, right? And so he was an educated young brother. So that was in 1605. So we continue to go on. We have housing discrimination, segregated townships. None of this is new to anybody, I'm assuming, right? So we continued it with our domestic scheme. We've all heard about the domestic scheme. So what I know when I started at CAS is I want to know why there's an overrepresentation of black kids in care. I want to know where they came from. So I did a 10-year evaluation. I coordinated a program called Soul Journey, which would take young black kids in care to a historical black monument society. We've done Washington, D.C., Alabama. They walked across the Alabama Bridge. Nova Scotia, where kids were able to trace the slave ship that took their family from what part of Africa and landed and where. They learned that 85% of slavery actually went into Brazil, and only 5% came into North America. So to understand systems and that what happened to me and why are there so many black kids. And where kids would say to me, I'd rather be dead than be black, Tina, that's a problem. Because growing up black, it's not a crisis. Racism is a crisis. Violence is a crisis. Oppression is a crisis, right? And so we have to really name this because kids are internalizing it. So what we know is if 1 out of 4 kids into CAS are walking into the doors of prison. So one of the things that I keep saying at our organization is you are legally responsible for these children. Act like they're yours. Pretend their names are different than if you need to. But let's look at them as Children's Day. We know that the police are carding children as young as 9 years old, has potential future gang members. But we're not saying anything about it because it's not impacting us until it does. So a lot of our kids are known as the barrel children. Anyone got family overseas anywhere? And we send back barrels of stuff, right? Hence the barrel children, right? And so when we look at the fact that the 60s schemes took a lot of the aunties, the grannies, the mothers out of the Caribbean and were specialized and referred to by the Canadian immigration system to be the most slave-like mentality, which is why they specified and went to Jamaican Island specifically to recruit domestic scheme, to domestic health workers. So it is no surprise to me that a quarter of the children in care are direct Jamaican heritage. So 60% of the kids in care are black, and 33% are Caribbean, 26% specifically come from Jamaican heritage, right? That's not one that you go, well, that's a really big coincidence. No, you have to then look and go, what do the systems think about Jamaican mothers? What do the systems think about Jamaican men, right? And so in that system, I do a lot of education in regards to the fact that black men can be really great fathers. This concept that black men do not want to be part of their children's lives, educating them that when you walk into a family's house, you don't keep your shoes on because you're afraid you might have to run. You're a guest in someone's home. That is a respect in any home. Walking into a black community does not require armed police guards. You must be aware of the privilege of walking in. And so we do a lot of these conversations. And so when you're a guest in someone's home, you don't ask that guest, are your children by the same father? We don't say those things, right? And so having really hard conversations. This is some of the people's faces are like, wow, people say that? You would be surprised what people say out loud in this room and to each other. And then people in positions of power, when we work with, clients, service recipients, we have this elitist, I know best. I'm the professional. I'm the expert. We're not asking these families. And so one of the biggest things that I do is address the systemic barriers. I identify the fact that what brings kids into care. When in visits, a mother doing a child's hair is not considered to be quality time. I learned most of my lessons on the floor between my aunties and mothers and granny's knees getting my hair done. And we talked about real life relationships. And so having those conversations that when the mother says to the child, boy, I'm going to lick you, she's not really going to kill that child when she gets home. That does not require a CAS involvement, right? Like having real conversations. So one of the things that we do, if anyone's familiar with it, is called the One Vision, One Voice. It's online. It's a recommendation. It looks at a community involvement to hold children's aid societies across Toronto responsible. So when I took this job, I'm not going to say it was an easy job. It's wow. I do a lot of personal calls to Brother Aubrey saying, are you people freaking crazy up in there? Like, seriously, this is not okay. And he's like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Right? And so part of what I get to do is agitate. My job is to be a Black Education Awareness Coordinator. That's what I'm paid to do, to create awareness of Black education. In order to do that, I must talk about the barriers to Black inclusiveness, to systemic anti-Black racism. And we must talk about white supremacy and how that we've inherited the system that privileges some and discriminates others. So when we look about who, oh, my time's done. And so a lot of what we do is do a lot of community involvement. I lead a lot of community conversations, both on the record and off the record. The issue at CAS came back. Anyone familiar with the Caribbean Camera or the Share magazine, right? Okay, so in 1976, it was called the Gazette. And in 1976, there were two stories that looked at the fact of the concern of the black community brought it to head. That's how many years? 22, 32, something like that? I'm also suck in math, and that's why I'm a social worker, right? And so we have to look at the fact of why kids come into care. Black families there are not more incidents of malpractice and abuse. There are more incidents of calls coming in. So if I'm going to make 10 calls and only one's going to be about a white child and 9 are going to be about black children, how many people do you think are going to be talked about that day? How many visits are going to be going to black families' homes? Right? And so these are the things that we challenge, is the referral process and the barriers and the anti-black racism that continues, that a child coming to school with a patty and a juice box is a healthy lunch and is not deserving of a neglect and therefore a call home to CAS that your child did not have a proper healthy diet. Right? So those kind of cultural norms, I don't know about y'all, but I remember when those like dry noodles were going around and kids were taking dry noodles to school. That's not healthy. Right? But no one called CAS on that stuff, right? So we have to have real conversations. We have to look at the fact that most of our community is coming from outside of Canada nowadays. We have different cultural norms. And so it's not about, you're in Canada, now you must do. I'm 6 generations Canadian. So then I think I get to make up what's standardized as norms, right? And so again, it's about recognizing that not everything is the same way, and we have to identify the social location of people we're coming into. So there's this concept that if you're black, any black family will do. Well, let me just be really clear that if I told my brother-in-law, who's Trinidadian, that he was the same as a Jamaican man, right? Right? Everyone was like, nope. So how then can we assume that this big continent, Africa, is the same across? Or that African American is the same as Nigerian or Jamaican or St. Vincent? We have to look at the fact that blackness is a very diverse and inclusive culture that has lots of lovely richness of uniqueness. And this concept that one-stop shop, any black will do, we need to challenge, and it's a constant challenge that we do there. We look at why kids are in care. We know the fact that kids come into care are 30 times more likely not to go home. So exactly. And that's a really scary stat, that I'm going to bring a child into care, and once you've been in care longer than 60 days, the chances of you going home have decreased dramatically. Most of our kids are in care longer. Black kids are then bounced around to many homes, and most of our black kids are outside of the GTA and rural farmer towns. Right? So the implications, and how do we internalize, and how do we deal with that? So a lot of what I do is do education with our black kids. So I expose them to African, Canadian, Caribbean history. We went back to the Jamaican islands. We took a Jamaican tour guide who was a historian and walked us through, taught her cultural norms, taught them the way with most of these Jamaican kids who have never been home or even been to the island or experienced traditional food. Where I had one child say to me, yeah, Auntie, this isn't real Jamaican food. So I'm in Jamaica, I'm in Kingston, Jamaica at the University of West Indies. And we are being cooked for by aunties and grannies. And so I said, you ever had Jamaican food? And she said, yeah, my mom makes it all the time back home. And I said, is she Jamaican? She said, no, but she can read. And I thought, okay, so that concept, right? That recipe says, now I know my granny added a dash of this and a split of this, and right? And so that recipe doesn't include that. So those things that we all know is the talk that happens, that our children that we do, our children in care are not getting that talk. So a lot of what we do is bring that to home. Very real conversations happen during informal moments with your children. And how do we have that? So one of the things I do is I teach foster parents on how to engage in difficult conversations, right? A lot of our workers are prepared to talk about personal things of violence and abuse and so forth, but are uncomfortable talking about racism. So whose issue is that? Because trust me, kids are not comfortable talking about their personal issues with strange white people in their homes, right? And so having those conversations, challenging workers to have their own place of discomfort and move on. And a lot of what we do continues. So one of the things that we have is a community advisory that is housed with 23 agencies, including our own staff, and various. And if you're not involved and are part of the Black community and want to have a voice, call CAS. I'd like to be involved in the Community Advisory Committee. You have a right. It is a public-funded organization, right? Check it. Use your website. Look at it. Have people accountable. What are you doing about it? Where's the result? This is a public-funded organization, and we need to stop being afraid of the liability that surrounds CAS. We can't dare challenge CAS, right? Challenge. Someone needs to hold them accountable, besides Aubrey. What else? Okay, so we continued. We do a lot of work. We do a lot of capacity building. This past weekend, I presented at a national conference with one of the youth in regards to Soul Journey. He's a youth who went from a 40% average to an 80%, been on the executive or the honor roll for 3 consecutive years, and is now going into Humber College for Community and Social Justice, right? And this is not yay on me. This is yay on him, that he knows he has a choice and value. And when I asked him what was the difference, he said, for the first time in my life, I thought there was something I could be besides a gangster and a baller. You took me to university, you showed me things that I could be. We exposed him to possibilities that exist for Black people around the world if given the opportunity and support. And from there, it was a proud moment to see him stand up at an international conference and say, I would not have been able to do this had I not have been exposed to my own culture first and foremost. And his worker was a white woman, right? And so people go, whoa, really? A lot of solidarity comes from other racialized groups, right? And so that is, it's not a divide and conquer, it's a unified place, and we can only get there in the place of unity if we respect our distinct differences first. And that's the biggest thing that I really try and push with our youth, is we all have a different walk in life, but we all have the same rights to the dignity and respect that each person is encountered for or embraced for. Whew, done.